Thank you for coming. We're happy to welcome a speaker, Hugh Patterson, who is going to be speaking about something that is functionally very important in terms of sort of language documentation, which is language archival, as this important sort of connection piece between researchers of various stripes, an important sort of meeting place for them to sort of put their data in and share data and sort of make their own stuff better. So please welcome Hugh Patterson.
All right, so there is a handout for those of you who don't have one. I'm not going to be referring to some details on the slides that are in the handout, so you may want the handout, or at least to reference it. I've titled my talk today, Archives and Data Ecology, and I'll go through and expound on some of those ideas. In the handout right before the bibliography, I have a section of key terms, so if you want to see what I say, or how I define my terms, you can look there. So a couple of core concepts, I'll go over those real quickly, and then I'll go through my talk, I'll touch on different of these core concepts. Some of them are language artifacts, data ecology, archives, and lexical databases. So I'm going to structure this talk in two sections, more theory in the beginning, and big ideas, and then a case study towards the end. I used to work in the archive doing the sessions. That's when people bring things to the archive and then you have to label it, find out what it was and how to appropriately care for it. So they bring it in buckets sometimes, right? So this is a survey of the dialects and languages of Sulawesi, I think. So so data ecology, kind of quickly, is we all create these language artifacts. So language artifacts, they might be the audio recordings, it may be a grammar or a book or a text or a video or something like that. But the data ecology is how do we share that back and forth? Just like in the nature sciences, you have animals and trees and plants and this biosphere kind of thing. So you can think about the same thing with the way we handle data. In archives, there's a couple of different uses of the term, and I will talk about that later. So you can see my office, I didn't just deal with audio, but lots of different things. And I dealt with endangered linguists as well. So this is Carolyn Ward, she brought in a collection to the archive of about 480 items. So it's a pretty substantial collection. Transcriptions, texts, audio texts, and all from Ecuador and northern Peru, I believe. So I helped her walk through how to do what archivists do and label everything and such like that. So to kind of talk about how this applies to language documentation, I'd like to take a look at photographs, which are, interestingly enough, not, so to say, language artifacts very often, but thinking more broadly about the difference between like a snapshot and a photograph. We can take audio or video segments of language use and language performance. Himmelman and Woodbury talk about this and kind of their defining language documentation papers in 1998 and 2003, I believe it is. So I wanted to kind of contrast just a snapshot here and kind of an attitude that Ansel Adams is attributed to saying the photograph is usually looked at and seldom looked into. So there's like nothing, usually in a photograph there's nothing that like draws you in. And so it was his goal to kind of like create photographs that would draw you in and make you want to look at those. So as language documenters, which kind of language artifacts do we create, right? So this picture on the left here is Ansel Adams' picture, and this is another guy's photo from somewhere about the same kind of thing. There's another interesting attitude out there that I found this quote quite interesting about photographs. It says, actually, I'm not all that interested in the subject of photography. Once the picture's in the box, I don't care anymore. Hunters, let's see, hunters after all aren't cooks, right? So, David Nathan, for a long time, was the archivist at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies. And he has a very interesting paper in 2010 that talks about an epistemology of audio and talking about this kind of difference between just going out and getting proof that language is used a certain way and actually like how to create documents of interesting language use. So it's kind of that same kind of dichotomy, that idea. So talking about what is a good language artifact, right? So to go back to this ecology of data, once we have these artifacts, how do we trade them? How do I help you make good use of them? How do you help me make good use of them and enrich them and things like that? Language artifacts make up a significant portion of the linguistic data, right? So we have scripts like prot scripts, we have things that are numbers and numeric, and we have attitudinal surveys, but a lot of what we do actually is like speech performance kind of stuff. That in the scope of the larger sciences, right? So the last May, the National Academy here in the US, they had a conference. Obama had a kind of thing that he set forth, a mandate, wanted the National Academy to collect the minds of the greatest thinkers and bring them together on what to do with data sharing and data connection. And that's kind of, this is kind of a real topic that we're going to have to deal with, in not just linguistics, but more broadly in the hard sciences as well. So there's that conference, and there's a conference in France as well that dealt, I think, more with the EU kinds of things. And one of the dangers if we don't think about this data is that it's the erosion of the evidence, right? So in a digital world, how quickly are things gone, right? You cite something, but then where do you go to find it, right, afterwards? And some of you may know that, or work this way, but the science isn't always what's actually published. If you have lab methodologies, those are rarely published in the papers, but sometimes they may be somewhere on some website, but how long do those stay around, right? So the information needed to help you understand what's actually published in the peer-reviewed publication is actually lost. And so those kinds of things, we want to preserve that so that we have continued access to that. This is not just, at this level, we're not just talking about like the knowledge of how those like lab materials were, or those lab methods were conducted, right? We're talking about the data. So if we run a couple of experiments and something doesn't work, right? You just don't get it the first time. You're not successful in proving your hypothesis. Those things usually aren't published, right? So, but they may uncover anomalies, and those anomalies, then we don't know that they exist, and our peers don't know that they exist. And if you don't have some way of looking at these things in a broad kind of scope, then you don't have really, you don't really have a way of seeing, well, when does this anomaly occur, right? So we don't want to just do the information, we want to do data, the actual, maybe it's a set of WAV files, or maybe it's a corpus of numbers. And that goes through then life cycle kinds of things. And I'll talk about life cycles here in a second. So at that conference, there was the chief librarian of the MIT Library Services. He gave one of the lectures at the conference sponsored by the National Academy. And Altman kind of puts forth the information life cycle. life cycle, and I'll talk about that here in a second and show you then how partners in this information life cycle fit to that. But we can track information ecology as being somewhat different than data ecology. This is a map of Twitter when it was announced that Tokyo was going to be the site of the 2020 Olympics, right? So some people got really excited and they just exchanged a lot of information about this. And we could track that. That's not really tracking like files and how, you know, maybe bit turn, if I could draw a map of bit turn and how files move around through that, that might be a better way to, but I don't have those kind of tools. Anyway, information lifecycle is kind of like this. It kind of goes around in a circle, and surely it starts somewhere. It starts here in design, creation, and production, right? But depending on where you enter into a project, right, you may enter in at different places, and so that's why I say it's kind of, well, maybe it doesn't always start there. But when you're thinking about maybe writing a grant for a field language documentation project, and then you're thinking about methodologies maybe for a lab scenario, you're definitely in the design and data creation phase of the cycle, right? But if we talk about sharing our data with colleagues, maybe I'm in the field and simultaneously I have a colleague somewhere who's writing grammar on this language, and I'm just getting a couple of files for him because he wants me to check a couple of things out. So how do I share that data, and do we have a platform? Maybe it's Dropbox, but maybe there's something more substantial. Maybe I could put it into the institutional archive. Here at the U of O, I understand we have Scholars Bank. SIL has a very similar piece of software. It runs the same core technologies, and we call that REAP internally. But there's then, how do you get it into that? That's the storage and ingest kind of question. Then you have your processing of your data. You have to like kind of make sure the WAV files are the right length, and you've got your prot scripts set up to get things analyzed in that. You have this internal sharing, which we talked a little bit about already, and then you have your analysis, right? So what the prot scripts spit out, that kind of thing. External dissemination. Let's say you know, you did an experiment here at U of O, and you did your work, and you found you have lots of recordings, but now somebody up maybe in the University of British Columbia wants to do something very similar. How much of that data, how can you then share with that person outside of your local organization, right? This becomes important kind of when we think about language documentation. Maybe where's the community of language speakers have access to what you're recording, and maybe the traditional stories and texts that you collect. And of course, maybe if you're thinking about educational materials, you don't want to just hear those texts, you want to weave them into a booklet or a story to teach people how to read. And then, like I've mentioned before, the long-term access kind of idea that goes beyond just you and me, and maybe we step out of the project and then somebody else will pick it up. How do they interface with that data? So this is a long-term kind of question. So to kind of talk about stakeholders, right? So that we're not the only one. We may be the ones that create this data, but we're not the only ones that actually use it, right? We have the subjects that we have to consider when we're talking about where does the archive fit in this whole ecology of things, right? So they have interests in our data. The researchers, they're heavily on this bottom and right side here. They're interested in the storage and if they don't have an easy way to ingest data into these kinds of large web-based systems usually, then it's not going to get used, right? You're going to find something easy like Dropbox instead of Scholars Bank. If it's too difficult to use Scholars Bank, it's just not going to work. But then the research organizations usually have a different kind of set of interests in this life cycle. And so they're more on that other side, right? Though there are some overlaps. So maybe the Scholars Bank is more concerned with long-term access or reuse of data. But they're not the only people, right? You probably have CAS IT in there somewhere, right? And service infrastructure providers, maybe they're building websites that are accessing the data from Scholars Bank or something like this. And research sponsors, when we write a grant proposal, they want to know where you're going to put your data when you collect it and that kind of thing. So they're interested in these long-term and reuse and external dissemination. Put different stipulations on it, like SOAS grants were that way. NEH grants are that way. Scholarly publishers are interested in these issues as well, whether it be open source publishing or open content kind of things. And data archives, obviously, as the institutional place that they're interested in this. And then consumers, the people who are going to read those texts or use those texts. The future researchers could be consumers, but language community speakers could be that. So you have a variety of different kinds of consumers there. So, so we in this life cycle, then we have quite a few stakeholders. So when we think about what is the